Welcome to Effective Approaches to Monitoring. We're glad to have you with us this afternoon. There will be Spanish interpretation available for this session. If you could go to channel 8. If you need interpretation and you have not gotten your headphone, you can go down to room 1 and pick that up. So let's begin. My name is Christine Campbell, and I'll be moderating your session today. Your presenters are Dr. Jonathan Sherwood. Dr. Sherwood oversees the Cloudburst Group's management of data collection, validation, and analysis for U.S. Department of HUD's community planning and development programs, including HOPWA, Continuum of Care, Emergency Solutions Grants programs. He works as part of the Housing and Community Development Practice area to provide direct support to communities across the country with planning and implementing special needs and homeless housing programs with a particular focus on compliance, monitoring, and grant management. Your other presenter for today is Lisa Steinhauer. She's a Community and Planning Development Specialist in the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Lisa has been working with the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing since 2014, where she is the office lead for housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, competitive grant portfolio. So please welcome our two presenters. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to use your app to ask questions. And as the moderator, I'll be looking at them and being able to do that. We will have opportunities for questions during the presentation upon cue as well as at the end. So enjoy, and with that, I present Dr. Sherwood and Lisa. I just like calling him Dr. Sherwood.
Thank you, Christine. No one does, so I appreciate that when I can get it. So welcome. It's great to see such a big crowd here, and let that serve as a reminder to mute your phones if you have your phone.
My one job as moderator, I was supposed to remind you to please turn your phones to silent.
But thank you for coming. It's great to see such a big crowd. We'll hopefully make what might be a not necessarily exciting topic pretty interesting and certainly informative for you. To start off, putting this presentation in context, I don't know how much it was highlighted. I don't think it was mentioned at the plenary session, but in the advanced materials. But there's kind of two tracks of presentations through the conference here at the Institute. One really focusing on program management or grant management, and the other on program delivery and design. So this is part of a kind of the grant management track, as it were. There's also a financial management training presentation and a policies and procedures presentation that all kind of dovetail together. We tried to design those presentations as a piece and have some common themes throughout. So if you are participating in that, kind of following that track, you'll hopefully see have some of the same messages reinforced. So real quick, let me just ask, how many of you are here representing a grantee? Raise your hand. Okay, so a lot. How many project sponsor? Okay, so fewer, and that makes sense. This is really the monitoring is obviously a grantee responsibility as well as a HUD responsibility, but I think that it'll be very applicable to everybody for subrecipients, sponsors, as well as the grantees. Let me ask another question at the outset. How many of you ever come across this tool either in printed form or a PDF? Okay, this is it's the HOPWA Grantee Oversight Resource Guide. It's available on the HUD Exchange website in the HOPWA section. One of a number of tools, but this is really the content for this presentation. Follows pretty closely with what's here in the manual. This guide was written about 10 years ago at this point, but it is still relevant. The program hasn't changed much in the meantime, and so a lot of what's in here we'll be covering today, and this is a real resource for you to use moving forward. And so it's available online at the HUD Exchange website in a PDF form. So our learning objectives for today, we're going to talk about, we'll hope you come away with an understanding of common and effective framework and approaches to grant oversight and monitoring. Know descriptions of basic monitoring terms and elements that will be helpful for you in your practice as a grant administrator and for you in working with HUD, because this is the language that they use, and gain awareness of common HOPWA monitoring hotspots. So all the presentations that you'll be attending through this institute will have this slide to reinforce the message that you heard at the welcoming plenary session of housing's role in ending the HIV epidemic. And some of the topics might seem more closely tied with actually supporting to end the epidemic and support people living with HIV and AIDS than monitoring might be. But what I would say as a grant administrator, since most of you are grantees, the tie-in here is really with helping you manage programs that are effective in the community that perform well, all on behalf of the ultimate targets of the HOPWA program, people living, low-income persons living with HIV and AIDS. So it's part of the larger support of running good, effective programs in your community is this oversight framework that we're going to be talking about. You'll see slides like this through the presentation where we'll be kind of ticking through the topics. These are the topics that we're going to be covering through the course of it, and Lisa and I will be trading off. And just bump me if I go past the slide where I'm supposed to transfer over.
Can you repeat the name of the manual, please?
Yes. The Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, the HOPWA Grantee Oversight Resource Guide.
And this could be a good plug for the online training curriculum as well.
Yes, and there is, you'll also find at the hudexchange.info website, if you navigate to the HOPWA program page, there's a related set of online trainings that was released about a year ago that build from the content of this guide as well, that go into some of the things we'll be talking about today, but in more detail. There were 3 modules to that online training that are available. There's actually a whole plethora of resources on the HUD Exchange website that have been developed for the HOPWA program.
So the online training curriculum as well is actually going to be a part of all of the FY17 grant agreements, whether you're a formula grant or a competitive grant, that at least one person from your organization needs to be taking that training. So if you haven't seen this already, which you may have seen this in a previous grant agreement, it will be in this FY17 grant agreement. So you can look forward to that, taking that course.
What training did you say it was?
It's the HOPWA oversight training.
Okay, because I took the financial management and had all the project sponsors take that a number of years ago because that was part of the grant agreement. But you're saying
This is a new training, yep,
this is new to me.
recently released.
I mean, I know the oversight guide, but the training on it is, I didn't know was on.
And we just released that, less than a year ago. So this is it's a newer training.
Right, thank you.
And it's a very user-friendly training. It's not, there is some light quiz taking throughout it, but it's not really heavy on the testing. The goal of it is really to expose you and transfer the information, expose you to the information in it. We'd love to save questions for later if we can, because we have a good bit of material to go through. Is there a question directly about the? The link it's hudexchange.info, and I think the HOPWA page might be /HOPWA. And then from there, you'll need to rummage through the resources. I don't have the link off the top of my head.
And if you,
.info, HUDexchange.info.
if you actually just type into the Google browser HOPWA Oversight Training, both the guide and the online training curriculum will pop up. That's actually how I get to it, rather than navigating through to a link. If you are having trouble finding it, please submit a question through the AAQ, and we'll be able to get that link directly to you. Oh,
Oh, good, the presentation, okay.
look at that. We were prepared.
We're way ahead of you. On the last slide of the presentation. Why monitor? It ensures accountability for to both to HUD and the American people, as well as to your community and your the targets of the HOPWA assistance in terms of what you are doing with your HOPWA grants. It helps ensure effective and efficient use of resources through the kind of analytic process of monitoring, oversight, and dialogue with your project sponsors. It helps assess the response that you're providing to community need, in addition to what you might do if you're a formula grantee through your con plan or action plan process. And of course, it's a HUD requirement that you do it. One slide that's not in here, but this I think is the place to insert it. It's a message that's reinforced through the oversight guide, is that the background for that last part, the HUD requirement, and the first bullet, ensures accountability, is on the downside, and this isn't really the focus of the training, but on the downside of all of this, the grantee is ultimately responsible to HUD and to the federal government for how funds are spent, and that includes how subrecipients or your project sponsors spend money. So if there was ever an issue or a problem with your program, and either the HUD field office or in the worst case scenario, Inspector General might be involved, it's the grantee that they're talking to, not the project sponsor, even if it was the project sponsor who may have been administering funds improperly or had some sort of issue. So that's just the the background, but that's not the focus of this. What I think we want to talk about in this presentation is really seeing monitoring not at in that here comes HUD, bum, bum, bum kind of framework, and that may be how it's often experienced by grantees, whether competitive or formula, as a potentially threatening experience. But from my experience with most field office staff, and certainly with grantees, is that that's not really where folks are coming from. Everyone, I think, is primarily on the same page of wanting to have success at the local level and wanting it to be a supportive and collaborative process. So in thinking about, as grantees, working with your project sponsors with monitoring oversight, it would encourage taking that kind of perspective and approach, as it's really part of your, as a grantee, your training and technical assistance down to your project sponsors that is in the oversight and monitoring process. So one of the bedrocks of the whole oversight and monitoring process is having the tools in place for yourself as a grantee and for project sponsors in place to really understand what the responsibilities and requirements are.
John,
And,
can you speak a little closer to
oh, thank you. What your requirements and responsibilities are to each other and to HUD and to the community in terms of what you're going to be providing and how you're going to provide it. And so we're going to be talking about some of those tools, some of those grant management tools in this training, in the policies and procedures training, and in the financial management, all kind of dovetailing together. So in the context of, for this presentation, we'll be starting with the grant agreement or contract, whatever the language might be that you use, that the grantee has with the project sponsor. I've, as a technical assistance provider, seen a very large variety of types of contracts and grant agreements that grantees use with project sponsors. But that grant agreement document, and municipalities and state governments and county governments will have a large variety of what those documents look like. But ideally, they contain some elements because they're really they're the point of accountability for all the parties involved. So with that grant agreement, it should contain, talk about what the scope of services is going to be, describing the funded HOPWA activities in at least some generalities, any outcomes, outputs, or expected goals for the project. Ideally, it clarifies on behalf of that project sponsor what they need to do to get paid, what their obligations are to report to the grantee. It should include, ideally, any standard tools if the grantee requires a particular reporting form or a particular invoice form, or has, for example, a HOPWA program manual that they use that articulates different standards or any other standard forms. They should be referenced either directly or by reference in the contract. Because if you expect, as a grantee, talking to the grantees now, if you expect a project sponsor to do X, Y, or Z, you really need to have told them about that up front, and the nexus for that is the contract, that grant agreement. So you may have a standard contract that you can't really vary from your ESG programs to your HOPWA programs to whatever other types of money you might have. But usually through the attachments, exhibits, or appendices to those grant agreements is where you can attach things like standardized forms, reference a project manual, a program manual, that sort of thing. So that contract is going to be the first kind of bedrock for establishing the oversight and compliance framework between the grantee and the project sponsor. So as a project sponsor, that's the kind of thing you ideally want to see in your contracts as well, because again, if there's an expectation, it should be memorialized in that agreement. Next thing we want to talk about is Oversight Plan and how to go about it. Now, what we'll be talking about today is both, and I'll just mention it here and we'll go into more detail. Lisa will be talking more about it, is on-site monitoring, which is what most people are familiar with. When you think of monitoring, you think of going out, looking at records, pulling out client files, spending a day or two on-site at a project sponsor's offices, that sort of thing. The vast majority of your oversight activity is not going to be that. And so I think we want to encourage you to think broadly about what it means to perform oversight and monitoring, and not kind of think again of the monitoring in that parachuting in and diving into records for days. But really it's when you're reviewing invoices, when you're reviewing quarterly or monthly or annual reports, or any documentation. So what you want to do, either explicitly in an actual written out plan or at least informally, is have a plan for how you're going to meet your obligations as a grantee to perform oversight, and make sure that your sponsors are doing what's expected of them. These are some of the different tools that we could spend a lot of time on. Is anyone else impressed with how hot it is in here, or is it just me? Up here in front of everybody, it's slowly dawning on me how hot it's getting. So we'll try and keep that in mind as we go forward. We could talk a lot about all of these, but these are some of the different elements, including conducting a risk analysis, and we'll again say more about that, remote and on-site monitoring, activities. No, identifying and being clear who on your staff as a grantee is going to be responsible for either the remote or on-site monitoring, what that's going to look like if you do site visits with your project sponsors, how's that going to be scheduled, how often, and have some explanation to your project sponsors about what it is that you're doing, what your expectations are, and make it, again, part of a positive and constructive and ongoing relationship between the grantee and the project sponsor that's not all reduced to one high-stakes site visit every other year or every year or whatever it is, but really is more of an ongoing relationship between it. We have more about risk analysis, right? Okay, so I won't get into it too much here. So here we go, monitoring terms and descriptions. So some of the common terms that we'll be talking about: risk analysis. Who here, as part of your grant management processes, does anything that you would consider a risk analysis? Great. What's that? Well, required and doing that's a separate question, right? And so for a risk analysis, I think, again, is something that can be a real positive part of your relationship between the grantee and the project sponsor, because everybody's grant looks different, everyone's formula or competitive grant looks different. Some of you get millions and millions of dollars, some of you get thousands of dollars. Some of your sponsors have one staff person, some of your sponsors might have a dozen staff persons and be spending lots of money out in the community, and all of those are different things that will inform risk and help you think about where to spend your energy as a grantee in allocating your time, because you only get 3% for admin. You, as a grantees out there, you don't have a ton of resources necessarily for it. But think about what your hot spots are. So we'll be talking about that throughout the presentation. The remote and on-site we've already talked about a little bit, and we'll be going into. And then this language of findings, concerns, and action, correction action plans or corrective action plans are really language that would be familiar to you from HUD monitoring of grantees. The findings being something more serious and substantial and that really constitute a threat to the particular grant and award, whereas a concern is more of a red flag that might be identified through remote or on-site monitoring, and then a corrective action plan, just a follow-up for how the grantee and the project sponsor will work together to change that. And all of that is, these are all concepts that are flowing down to the grantee and talked about a good bit in the book here, directly from this is how HUD approaches it, and so this is how you can most easily approach it as well with your project sponsors. Thanks for opening the door. I feel a little better up here, so hopefully it feels better elsewhere in the room. Just let us know if it gets too noisy. Yeah.
How often should a grantee monitor its sponsor?
That's an excellent question. Who has a good answer? How often should a grantee monitor a project sponsor? Once a year? At a minimum. Do you mean on-site or overall? So that would be my first question. What do you mean by monitoring? We've been talking about remote monitoring as being an ongoing, likely at least monthly process if you're receiving monthly invoices. So there's going to be, if the question's on-site monitoring, again, I don't think that there's a simple answer for that. I think it depends on who the subrecipient is, what they do, what issues have come up in the past, all the things that go into a risk analysis. Are they doing an activity that is very low risk, like providing supportive services, where you're just paying for staff time to provide case management? Or are you doing higher risk activity like a tenant-based rental assistance program, where there's a lot of compliance issues and a lot of money going out the door? And is there a lot of staff turnover? That would be a trigger perhaps for more frequent monitoring. So I think that's not a simple question, but it's a very good question. So I've already jumped ahead, I guess, and talked about some of these concepts. But with that risk analysis is what we were just talking about. I think that it's a pretty straightforward and intuitive concept, and there's different things that can go into that in the guide. And I think it's in the second chapter. There's an appendix at the table that goes with it that is a sample risk analysis tool that you could use, and it looks at things like how much money do they get? Like, what's the size of the grant? The higher the size of that award to a project sponsor raises the risk factor. Is there staff turnover? Do they have a history of late or untimely invoicing? Do they have a history of inadequate documentation with that invoicing? So all of those things in that sample risk analysis tool and the oversight guide kind of gives you some things to think about how you might score it, what are some of the questions you might look at. And again, a lot of that is information you get through your normal processes of working with your project sponsors. And for the project sponsors out there, I think all of this is something to think about as you do your operations. These are the things that your grantee will have on their mind, and by extension, HUD will have on their mind as red flags. So if you're experiencing staff turnover, or if you know that you struggle to get your invoices in a timely basis, or you know that you're often getting towards the end of the year with unexpended balances, right? And having to rush to try and spend money by the end of the contract year, those are all red flags for HUD with the grantee, and by extension the grantee with the project sponsor. So all of these things are things for as project sponsors you can be using to think about your own work. And when we get into some of the details about monitoring some of the different activities, those are really relate directly to the sponsors out there. These are a breakdown of some of that language, the difference between a concern and a finding. A concern not based on statutory, regulatory, or program requirements, but still might be a red flag, and a finding is really some substantive deficiency in the program's performance based on, especially on non-compliance. We're going to talk about in detail what some of those hot spots, as it were, might be for it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. So as Jonathan mentioned, it's really interesting coming from the HUD perspective for this for the concept of monitoring, because I know that you as the grantee, you're monitoring your project sponsors, but at HUD we have our own monitoring process to ensure that the grantee is staying in compliance. And so one of the things that's really interesting when we look at those definitions of findings and concerns is our lawyers are very specific with us that if we cannot tie something back to a regulation, there is no possible way we will ever be able to issue that finding. And so that is a very clear distinction. But I do just want to say that concerns are also a really big part. And we actually like having concerns because it's a really great opportunity to take a look at something that is off, and it's not out of compliance yet, but it's a real chance to start working on something with that grantee. So we've now identified something, and through those corrective action plans, we actually, for findings, there are required steps that need to be taken in order to clear the finding. But we also provide recommended action steps for concerns to really show grantees what they can do to make sure that this isn't a continued issue or it escalates into a finding. And so I just say that as a way that we view the monitoring process, that you can really look at this, and it doesn't need to escalate to the point of someone being out of compliance, to really step in and use it as an opportunity to talk through something and get things back on track. So what I'm actually going to talk about is grant and participant level basic monitoring elements. And so really what these are all elements that are part of a basic oversight plan. And these are all going to be, not surprises to you, part of requirements from the HOPWA program. And these are also elements that, as we look at them, are going to be part of your policies and procedures. These are things that you're you should be, really spelling out in your policies and procedures as a way to translate to the project sponsors what needs to be happening. And it also, through your policies and procedures, identifying these different elements, you're able to have a concrete way as a grantee to ensure that these things are in compliance. So as Jonathan was saying, all of these different things are building blocks upon each other. So, he talked about contracts as a way to really identify everything that you are expecting from the project sponsor. So you're really identifying those. And then the policies and procedures kind of pull those out a little more so that you kind of have a guidance on how you're going to do that. And one thing that I will say, so once again from the HUD standpoint, how many people in here have seen the CPD Monitoring Handbook? Great, okay. This is a really important resource that actually our office, the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing at headquarters, put together as exhibits that go through the different requirements for the HOPWA program. And there's a number of questions. So when a field office rep goes out to a site, they're going to use this exhibit, and you've probably, if you haven't seen them and you look through them and you've had an on-site monitoring, you will probably recognize a lot of the questions. But the one thing that is really important about those exhibits and can probably be very helpful in your process is that every single question is tied back to the regulation to show you exactly where that requirement is coming from. And if there is no regulation and there is a negative response, or the answer is no instead of yes, for that question, then that's when you're going to be issuing that concern because it's not tying back to the regulation. I also just want to talk about these exhibits because when HUD comes to monitor, this is what we're using. It's never a surprise. And this should be the same type of thing that's happening between the grantee and the project sponsor. When you're having these, this monitoring relationship, it should never be a surprise to the project sponsor. All of these requirements need to be stated and present to that project sponsor so that they're able to comply with the requirements of implementing the program. So as Jonathan mentioned, there's different types of monitoring. There's on-site monitoring, remote monitoring, and then there's also the component of a risk analysis. This particular slide is looking at grant level basic monitoring elements. So this is really looking at how is the grant functioning as a whole. How are you administering the grant? How are the funds being spent at the highest level for this grant? All of these elements are things that should be a part of your remote monitoring process. And when we say remote monitoring, this is something that can be ongoing. I heard some of you in the audience saying, remote monitoring happens monthly. And this is absolutely something. Every time that the grantee or the project sponsors are submitting invoices, this is the perfect opportunity for you to look down a list of questions, and have that ongoing remote monitoring happening. And I do just want to kind of pull out the risk analysis here too, because a lot of these elements are things that should be looked at within the risk analysis as well. And the easiest way for me to really distinguish between remote monitoring and a risk analysis process is really looking at the risk analysis process is when you quantify where that grantee is. So you have a number of components that you're looking at. So let's say that you have historical expenditure rates, or you're looking at funding balances, unexpended funds. This is really a snapshot of where this grantee is at based on these factors, and you're able to quantify that on the basis of risk. This process of risk analysis as well is also going to be able to identify which elements have higher or lower risks. And as Jonathan said, there are activities that carry higher risks in general. At the HUD level, we do a risk analysis annually, which determines which grantees are going to be monitored. And I will say that there's some things that some grantees will just never score high in. These are things such as the amount of money that is given out to this grantee. If you are never reaching $500,000, you are never going to be risky in that category, okay? So it's really determining what you need to be looking at to figure that out. I also say that part of our ongoing monitoring process at the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing for the HOPWA program is we look monthly at IDIS. We have a tracker set up where we follow exactly what's happening in IDIS every month and see, are grants pulling down funds? Are there large balances? Are people spending in a timely way? And so that's part of our ongoing monitoring process. And if we do see that timeliness is off on spending, then we reach out to the grantee and we have that conversation with them. Okay, so this continues on with the grant level basic monitoring elements. And so there's a number of questions that are just pulled out to show the types of things that you can be asking through this ongoing remote monitoring process or picking up within the risk analysis. And I kind of just want to take a second to think through an example of something that could very possibly happen. So let's say you as a grantee have contracted out with a project sponsor, and your contract with them provides funding for 20 households to receive both TBRA and supportive services. On the most recent risk analysis, this grantee showed very low risk. There was no need for an on-site monitoring visit right away. But in recent months, through your ongoing remote monitoring process, you realize that their invoices for reimbursement have started to decrease. And you're seeing this for a few months. So you decide to look a little deeper into the budget line items. So you notice that, while the supportive service dollars are remaining steady, showing that 20 households are being served, TBRA has dropped to about 12 households. And this is automatically a red flag for this grantee. And so the grantee kind of has, a few options that they can look at in this scenario. But let's say in this example that the grantee decides to reach out to the project sponsor. And they inquire, they say, okay, we see that your invoices are decreasing and TBRA is decreasing. What's happening? And through this conversation, they learn that there's been some recent situations that have caused strained relationships with landlords, and they're having a really hard time finding units within FMR. Now, in this scenario, the grantee reached out to this project sponsor, and they were able to resolve this through some technical assistance and kind of, problem solving to make the regulations work for the scenario that that was presented. But it's through that ongoing monitoring that they were able to identify that sooner rather than later. So this is what I just wanted to pull this out as a really strong example of how ongoing monitoring can really help mitigate larger situations from coming forward.
Lisa, what does IDIS stand for?
Oh boy.
Integrated Disbursement Information System.
Integrate. Okay. I only know it as IDIS. We love acronyms at the federal level. So if you are not familiar with IDIS, I'm assuming you're probably a project sponsor. IDIS is the system that grantees use to draw funds down from their grant and identify them at the budget line item level, the project level, and the activity level. Okay, so yeah, the one thing that I just really wanted to pull out from this is, monitoring is really a great tool to have an ongoing conversation and relationship with your project sponsors. I mean, ultimately, especially from the HUD perspective, our goals for the HOPWA program are to establish and maintain stable housing, reduce risks of homelessness, and access to care. What's the verb that I need here? But what are you doing? Promote access to care? Just, yeah. All right, so a really good verb, insert it, access to care. So, I mean, all of this, at every level, from HUD to the grantee, the project sponsor, we all have the same goals that we're coming back to, and it's to really make sure that we're assisting those clients who are the eligible HOPWA clients in the end. So speaking of eligible HOPWA clients, we move to the participant level basic monitoring elements. So we're at the grant level, we're really looking at the grant as a whole. We're taking a step down to look at how the participant is interacting with the HOPWA funding. These basic elements, HIV verification, releases of information, income documentation, rent calculations, annual certifications, habitability standards, individual housing plans and service plans. These are all elements that are really establishing eligibility and ensuring that activities are being provided in compliance with HOPWA regulations. These elements here, where the last slide, the grant level, could really focus on remote monitoring, this is really going to require on-site monitoring. Where you can really kind of look at some of the grant level spending to identify possible issues at the participant level. To really understand if there is HIV verification, you're going to have to go to the organization and look in those client files to verify that these elements are present and in compliance. So just looking at each of these, and I'm not going to get too far into any of these because we have really great sessions on a lot of this information. And so when we're looking at activity level, you're going to get into this in policies and procedures and other sessions here at the Institute. But when you are looking from a monitoring perspective for HIV verification, you're going to be looking that the HIV verification is either signed off by a physician or other certified health professional. It's in Social Security documentation or it's verified through another federal program. This other piece, release of information, things that you can look for, is it time limited and is it updated annually, and is it in compliance with local, state, and federal laws? We will be getting into the hot spots a little later, but I do want to say, especially with the releases of information, the one thing that I will say to be very careful about is making sure that the release of information is not a blanket statement, because landlords and providers of supportive services may need to know very different things when referring a client, and when you have a blanket statement, it opens up some situations that would not be favorable of confidentiality. Okay, and then the other piece of eligibility, so we know that we have HIV verification and then income documentation. So all clients need to be considered low income to participate in the program. A few of these questions here to look at as part of the monitoring elements involve rent calculations. Has everyone seen the HOPWA income calculator, resident rent calculator? Oh, that is great. Yeah, so if you have not, this is a great tool that's available on the HUD Exchange, and we're actually demoing that in the resource room. So if you are unfamiliar with this particular tool, I highly recommend getting well acquainted with it. It helps make sure that you're in compliance with calculating the resident rent payment at both 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income and 10% of the family's gross income, and making sure both of those are documented in the client folder and that the client, it's verified that the client is paying the higher of the two. The other thing to look for, zero income certifications, and then income recertifications. So, you know, you're really, when you're looking at these client files, it's not enough to just have that first certification or that first income verification. If that client is on the program longer than a year, these annual updates need to be documented in those client files as well. And this also goes for habitability inspections, which need to be done at move-in and annually for all units. The other piece here is a lead paint visual assessment. So HUD regulations does require that if there is a child 6 or under, or the dwelling is built in 1978 or earlier, that a visual inspection needs to be made. This is another piece where there is an online training. So as you're going through and looking at the HOPWA habitability standards, and if that is a piece of it, there's an online training to have staff understand and be prepared to make that lead paint visual assessment.
Is there a specific form that should be used for the HQS?
That is a good question. So is there a specific form for HOPWA habitability standards? We do not have a specific form, but this oversight guide actually has a number of checklists and forms in it that you can pull from and use as you're going through those inspections.
On the at least currently, and I don't know if this will be changed in the near future, but on the HOPWA section of the HUDexchange.info website, there is an area that is called something like the Grant Administration Toolkit that has a number of unofficial, meaning they're not, don't have HUD legal stamp of approval on them, but they're unofficial resources for grantees and project sponsors to use, and included in that is a HQS form. But I'll tell you what that form is, and this is the kind of form that when asked, when I'm working with grantees or sponsors would do. It's a form that really just literally pretty much repeats what's in the regulation in terms of HQS to keep it as flexible as possible. HQS, unlike say the habitability standards, unlike the housing quality standards HQS that apply for the Section 8 program, those are very well articulated, detailed, require trained inspectors and whatnot. The HOPWA program does not. So the forms will be, that I've seen and the ones that I've recommended are just literally just repeating in a checklist form the language from the regulation, which leave a lot of room for common sense application on the organization's part.
Yeah, thank you. And then the last question here is there documentation indicating that rent reasonableness was completed? And this is another area which will probably be discussed in the hotspots, but just because a unit is within FMR
and that's documented in the client folder. You also need to show that that rent is reasonable for the area. So pulling other units that are similar in size and location and showing that the rent that is being paid towards that client's unit is in line with other units on the private market in that area.
Are these the same requirements as for ESG, pre-housing and homeless prevention? Are they the same? Can you use the same ones for both?
I actually love that you just asked that question. So the question was, are these requirements the same as for ESG or the homeless programs? No. There may be some overlap, but HOPWA as a program has their own set of regulations, and so the regulations that are codified at 24 CFR 574 are specific to HOPWA. ESG and COC have their own set of regulations elsewhere under the title of 24. I don't know that number because I am very specifically focused on HOPWA.
576 for ESG.
So there's been a couple questions about the oversight guide and the HUD monitoring exhibits being updated to reflect 2 CFR 200.
Another great question. And I'm glad that these questions are coming up because sometimes I feel like people may not know that 2 CFR 200 happened. So the oversight guide has not been updated for 2 CFR 200. When that was put out, those the final rule was not completed. And I don't believe the oversight online curriculum did that.
It does.
Okay. So the good news is the online training curriculum, which actually just came out within the past year, that does recognize 2 CFR 200 requirements. And with that being said, there actually were not large sweeping changes for the HOPWA program under 2 CFR 200. So while I would say that if you are using the oversight guide, that you should definitely make sure that if it is referring to Part 84 and 85, you're looking for that updated regulation. A lot of the requirements that went into 2 CFR 200 that consolidated all of those OMB circulars did not make huge changes for HOPWA. Are there any other questions?
Yes, there are. Is the CPD Monitoring Handbook on the HUD website?
Another good question. Yes. The CPD Monitoring Handbook is available on the HUD Exchange. If you, once again, it's one of those Google things. If you Google CPD Monitoring Handbook, it will come up. HOPWA is Chapter 10. I worked on that for about 2 years, so I hope you'll all go look at it.
And one note on that, with the new CPD exhibit, the oversight guide was originally written very directly to mirror the CPD monitoring exhibits at the time. But there have been some changes, not more in form than in substance, because the regulations haven't changed that underpin the monitoring exhibits. But I just wanted to point out that is a feature of the oversight guide. It was really an attempt to take the HUD speak from the monitoring exhibits, which are very formal and refer to regulations and have very specific language, and translate it, make it a bit more user-friendly for grantees and project sponsors, but it's intentionally the guide. It still very closely reflects the same questions that HUD would be looking at with a grantee are in the guide for the grantee to use, so that you have a nice congruence there, so that if the grantee is asking these questions, that they're the same questions that they're going to be asked by HUD with the exhibit.
Yeah, and the one great thing, actually, so the CPD Monitoring Handbook was just recently updated and released at the beginning of summer. And the big changes that are seen in that are actually it was updated to reflect the new 2 CFR 200 requirements. So you're really going to be able, if you are starting to monitor for those specific requirements, you can use those exhibits as a guide that link back to the HOPWA regulation that covers 2 CFR 200 to really point at that. And then the other thing that's great is the old requirements at Part 84 and 85, those exhibits are still available. So if you are still operating a grant that is required to comply with pre-2 CFR 200 requirements, which only came into effect on December 26, 2014, then you can actually go back and look at those requirements for the specific grant if you're still monitoring that money. Okay, our clients' blood work required for the charts. So to have HIV verification, it just requires having a signed document from a physician. This doesn't mean that you need to see the exact levels of where they are with viral load or CD4 count. However, I will say this with a caveat that as a program, we're really pushing to start collecting this health data at a client level to be able to track and show how housing is really is a part of that, a part of improving health outcomes. And if you are actually interested in learning more about that, there's a great session on the HIV Housing Care Continuum that I know is being offered a few times, and it really looks at if you have worked with the HIV Care Continuum and you're familiar with that, it's looking at overlapping housing with that and showing those outcomes along that continuum.
So we have a few questions about housing quality standards and habitability.
Mhm.
Do you want to do those now, or do you want to?
I think maybe we can hold
Yeah,
some of them, 'cause we might get to.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so we're gonna hold the questions for a little bit, but we have a quick pop quiz. This is where we're gonna hear from you. So the first question on the pop quiz is, habitability inspections are not required in HOPWA-funded facilities if the facility is owned by a HOPWA grantee or project sponsor. Oh my gosh, you guys are so good. All right, that's good work. All right, so the second question is, or I guess statement. If a TBRA program participant is pregnant and a child under the age of 4 will be living in the unit, a lead-based paint visual assessment is required.
Yeah.
So true or false?
True, but it depends.
True. Actually, requirements say that if a child under 6 is living in the building, there still needs to be a visual assessment, and that can be done through the, yes. Yeah, under 6, there still needs to be a visual assessment. So there are, it's just an assessment, so as we,
Surprised it's not a risk assessment and not just the visual. Yeah, the kid living in, like CDBG or
mhm.
the other programs where you have to do a risk assessment.
Yeah. This is another time where I will plug that online training for visual assessment of lead paint, which will tell you all you need to know about the visual assessments. All right, well, you guys did good. That was excellent. And the last thing, and I don't want to belabor this, is just the individual housing and service plans. So as you know, HOPWA regulations require that all individuals, all clients are receiving a housing assessment and are having ongoing housing and an individualized housing and service plan that's updated annually. And so these, when you're looking at client files, this is another piece of information that you should be looking for and ensuring that that's updated regularly. All right, and now we get to monitoring hotspots, and I'm going to turn this back to Jonathan.
Okay. So we're going to start looking at some of the activities and talking about some of the details. And I'll reiterate the point. I don't know if we'll be able to get into all the details that you might be interested in, because there's a whole session on TBRA, there's a whole session on the short-term mortgage utilities assistance, a whole session on financial management. They can go into a lot more detail about what the requirements actually are. I think what we want to highlight here, and we can do our best to answer some of the technical questions, what we want to highlight here is these are issues to make sure that you're looking at when you're doing your oversight and monitoring activities. I don't know if we'll be able to get into every kind of detail about them, but we're going to dive into with the hotspots though and see how that goes. And before we do that, one point I wanted to make, to go back to a point that I made at the beginning about how ultimately it's the grantee, that's kind of responsible and on the line for the use of funds. I think one of the threads through this presentation that is probably more implicit than explicit, and I wanted to pull it out, and it's also in the financial management and the policies and procedures, is that of documentation, right? That's the kind of the key practice that we're talking about, because how I always describe it, what HUD's concerned with, what the federal government, not to put a HUD aside, what the federal government's concerned about is you're spending, the American people's money, right? They want to make sure that it's spent in a proper manner, that it's compliant with X, Y, and Z, that it's done efficiently and effectively, and all of those things. How that is measured in large part, how that examination of compliance is measured is through a documentation train. So a lot of these different things, when Lisa was talking, and I'll be talking in a minute about things like seeing rent calculations and seeing lead inspection assessments, or seeing housing quality or habitability assessments, that sort of thing. It's all about, you've spent $1, HUD wants to know, with that dollar spent on TBRA, was it spent on an eligible household? That has a bunch of documentation attached to it. Was it spent in an eligible unit? That has FMR documentation and the housing quality documentation, all that attached to it. Was it, was the tenant paying a proper portion of rent? That has a whole set of documentation attached to it. So that's kind of the thing to keep in mind, is all of this is really talking about that kind of universe of documentation that helps you and your project sponsors show to HUD, should they come looking, that you are spending their money in a proper way. So the problems, the hotspots that we're talking about, these are hotspots because if there's problems with the documentation, that's when things can get into trouble. So we're going to be talking about these different program areas, activities, the basic activities, housing assistance, supportive services, and financial management. Again, we're barely going to be able to do any of these justice because it's already after 4 o'clock. We're not really going into details about how to operate these programs, that these are just the areas that really come up as kind of compliance issues that we want to make sure you're aware of, and you can get more information in other trainings and with the online. Yep. And the presentations is in the app. If you go to the event on the schedule, it's there as a PDF. So all of this is already accessible to you, and you could email it to yourself and print it out from your phone, or whatever you can do with how smart your phone is. Or you are, no, but in figuring all that out. But it's there, and it should be, so all this shouldn't be lost. I know we've been running through it. So I'm going to be talking about the first two, housing in particular. So TBRA, I think, is probably at the top of the riskiest of the HOPWA activities, because it represents a lot of money that goes out the door. A lot of grantees spend an awful lot of money through their project sponsors on TBRA tenant-based rental assistance in their communities, and rightly so. It's a very effective housing intervention, but it also has a lot of, it's kind of the trickiest compliance-wise. There's a lot of different details to get right, and that if they're not right, there could be issues that come up with how you spent or your project sponsor spent those dollars. So right at the top, incorrect rent calculations. One of HUD's primary concerns is that your clients, that anyone who's participating in the program is not paying, either paying too much towards their rent, or they're also to make sure that they are paying what they should be towards their rent. And that gets into the rent calculations. There are whole trainings on how to do a proper rent calculation to determine. It's not just as simple as saying 30% of someone's income. There's all sorts of deductions and income inclusions, income exclusions, deductions, and all of that you have to go through the process, and that's that online rent calculator that's on HUD Exchange. That's all built into there, so you put in the right information, it'll put back the right rent payment for your clients. So that is a key one, and I can't emphasize that enough. I've seen it as a TA provider and as a housing provider myself as a real problem area where people have gotten into trouble, had to owe money to HUD because they had improper rent calculations or not well documented rent calculations underpinning all that money going out. And if HUD ultimately could say, you spent all that money on an unsupported basis, whether that be the rent calculations or maybe some of the inspections, we want that money back, right? We want you to pay us back because you spent it and you can't show us that you spent it on in a proper way. So that's just the alarm. I hate to be alarmist about all this, but it's just, I've seen it come up enough. So the rent calculations or income determination are two key areas, and that's connected with the incorrect HOPWA subsidy amount. Where that could come in is if the agency is overpaying for a unit, the household should be paying more. Or I've seen where communities have been, maybe had a household that's been on the TVRA program for a long time, their composition changed, they went from a 5-person household to a 2-person household, but they're still living in a 4-bedroom unit, and the program is paying for 4 bedrooms rather than 2 bedrooms or 1 bedroom, and that would be considered an overpayment, and that would be a real problem if that kind of thing's not identified through the recertification process. So all of these are, as you can see, the common theme here, a lot of them are financially related, and that's a big issue for the TVRA. And again, there's whole trainings on that. There's a whole TVRA, a HOPWA TVRA guidebook available on HUD Exchange that goes into a lot of detail about how to do all these steps. There's the online rent calculator, so we won't cover all the details, but it is the biggest one that I see is TVRA programs and not doing these things properly. That's where the ship can hit the beach. Also on it, and these are important as well, some of the other documentation might be missing. The lead-based paint, rent reasonableness is not done, or FMR, the applicability of the fair market rent is not documented. It's not documented in a client's file that the unit that they were approved for complies with the FMR limits, that there's not a signed lease on file. There's no documentation to back up that payment that's being made to a landlord. That's a biggie. Or that there's not proper habitability inspections or re-inspections on an annual basis in the file.
Clarify the requirement and the difference between housing quality standards and affordability.
Oh, yes, and I,
As well as who does which inspections.
right, and that's sloppy language on my part to, if I said housing quality standards, because it's habitability standards, the housing quality standards, HQS is the Section 8, the Housing Authority, much higher standard, so if you heard me say that, just wipe your brain and turn it off, pretend I said habitability standards, because that's what's in the regs, not HQS. You can apply HQS, and there are plenty of grantees and project sponsors that do. It certainly means that you're gonna have likely a higher quality of housing that is ultimately approved. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not required. HQS, those standards are much more explicit, do require training and certification. That is not required as part of the HOPWA habitability standards. There's no formal training required, just the documentation in a file to back up the payments made to a landlord.
And who does the first inspection, who does the annual?
Whoever's spending the money.
So the grantee or
The sponsor, unless there's an explicit arrangement. That's an interesting question. I've seen arrangements where, because this is a high, an important element to have those inspections in place, and because it can be a real burden sometimes on project sponsors to know how to do those. I've seen cases where this is the one activity that a grantee does they maybe have their housing department or housing authority do the inspections, but every other activity is done by the sponsors. But 99% of the time it's the project sponsor. So whoever is issuing the payments, signing those leases, signing the payment agreements on behalf of the project sponsor, that's who's going to be responsible for doing the inspections. So I want to keep moving to.
Just one more. Is there any specific form that needs to be filled out for habitability?
There's, just as I talked about earlier, there's the sample. There's no official form. But in the HUD Exchange, you can see some sample documents, including one of those. Short-term supported housing, emergency housing. This is not STARMU. Does anybody use this? This would really be if you're using HOPWA for emergency shelter beds. It's an eligible activity that not too many people do, but some people do. Some people do. So there are a handful of things to document in relation to that. There's specific in the regulations, specific time limits, and explicit requirements about service plans, housing plans, and the provision of case management that would be made in relation to that. You want me to keep going?
Yeah, this is still you.
Oh, okay, still me. All right. Facility-based housing assistance. I'm just mindful of the time. We're already a quarter after. We've only got about 15 minutes left. Facility-based housing, the big issues here are very similar. You have to have inspections, even if it's a facility-based housing. That goes back to that question, does facility-based housing, if housing's owned by a sponsor or a grantee, do they have to demonstrate compliance with the habitability standards? Yes, they do. So even if it's a self-inspection, the facility needs to be documented regularly, annually, as passing habitability. Resident rent is not calculated. This is, even after many years, this I think it's still an issue that comes up with facility-based housing, congregate housing, community housing, whatever you might be calling it. The same rent calculation that applies for TBRA applies in facility-based housing. The HOPWA regulations are pretty explicit. Everyone who receives HOPWA housing assistance, facility-based or tenant-based, pays rent. Rent is calculated using the whole process of looking at the annual income and the inclusions and exclusions and deductions and all of that. the 30% or 10%, all of that. It applies in facility-based housing, and program fees are not allowed. Charging residents fees other than rent is prohibited in the HOPWA regulations. So having documentation very similar for facility-based housing that you would have for tenant-based rental assistance. Okay, I'll pass it back.
All right, another pop quiz for you. All right, so true or false? STROMU may be utilized for payment of condo fees only if the fees are included as part of the monthly mortgage payment. You guys are so smart. I know. That's great. And this goes for taxes as well. So taxes should not be paid as part of STROMU unless they are part of that full payment for that mortgage monthly. All right, true or false? For TBRA program participants, TBRA may be used to pay the first month's rent. True. Yeah, and actually I like that there was a few different answers on that because this is actually a hotspot that we see come up a lot. Especially when programs are using PHP and TBRA together. So if you are using PHP, that means that that should be paying for the security deposit or any other security deposit or any other costs that would be getting that client into housing. TBRA is always going to start at that first month and move forward from there. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, so a few hotspots for STROMU. And so I just want to make sure before we get into some of these hotspots, just to recognize that the goal of HOPWA STROMU is to provide short-term interventions to help maintain stable living environments for households. And so this is really a short-term intervention which should be filling a gap for clients. And so one of the things to really look out for is lack of documentation identifying the need. So clients coming in for STROMU need to demonstrate a need for that assistance. Time limits are another really big thing. We have an entire guide dedicated to STROMU going over the nuances of this particular activity. When your program is implementing a STROMU program, you need to decide at the grantee level how you're going to calculate those time limits, and then that needs to be implemented with project sponsors going down. Housing need assessment and plans are incomplete. That's another thing to look out for. So even though this is a short-term intervention, this should be part of a program to ensure that that client is maintaining housing stability moving forward. So you still, a requirement of STROMU is still to have those housing needs assessment and plans in place and making sure that you're following up on that. Especially if they're identifying that this client is going to be unstable in their housing, even with the short-term intervention. So either looking at getting them into more permanent housing from there and so on, and you'll see that through those needs assessment. Income eligibility, still need to show that they are eligible to participate in the program. Ineligible costs, once again, all of this is covered in the STROMU guide, so I really hope that you will review this. I don't want to get too into the program operations of this. And then we go back to documentation, inadequate documentation or lack of documentation. So as Jonathan was saying, this is really the thing, documentation is really going to be showing that you are in compliance with the HOPWA regulations. All right, and supportive services. So some monitoring hotspots for this. Once again, we can't reiterate enough, documentation. So making sure that you're documenting the types of services in a client file and tracking those. This is something that is also reported out in your APR or CAPR. So making sure that you have documentation of all the services you're provided. Non-compliance with healthcare limitations. Healthcare should only be used as a last resort. So there needs to be documentation and files that know that HOPWA is the only source that this healthcare cost could be paid for. And then once again, lack of supportive service tracking details. Make sure you're tracking the supportive services. And ineligible costs. So this is something that we have seen come up a few times, especially with supportive services, looking at things like moving costs. So moving costs are not an eligible expense that should be paid for with supportive services. Another thing is field trips or recreational activities. We know that there are a wide variety of services that can be offered with supportive services, but making sure that they are tied to ensuring that that client is stably housed is important. This shouldn't be used for recreational costs like pottery classes, the only thing that comes to my mind. And then the last monitoring hotspot here are applying staff costs incorrectly. This is another huge hotspot that we see come up time and time again, especially with supportive services paying for case management. With billing in HOPWA, you really need to make sure that if the case manager is specifically working on a client for supportive services, that it's billed to supportive services. If that same case manager is working with that client through rent calculations for TBRA or anything that is tied to another housing activity, that case manager's time should be billed to that activity, not supportive services. So you really need to make sure that you're parceling out and identifying what that case manager is doing and clearly being able to show that that was a supportive service activity that they were engaging in and it was not TBRA or STROMU or another HOPWA eligible service.